Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Jacob Mackey. Jacob L. Mackey is Associate Professor of Classics at Occidental College in Los Angeles, where he teaches Greek and Latin languages and literatures, their transformative reception by African American writers, their centrality to the American project of self-governance, and their power to transport us beyond our current culture of resentment. He is a faculty advisor for the Student Persuasion Club, which provides a space for the free exchange of ideas on campus. He grew up between Austin, Texas, and a small village in Kerala in South India. The darker side of his experience in India, growing up in a cult, is captured in a documentary film. He is planning a memoir about the brighter side. He is the author of Belief and Cult: Rethinking Roman Religion, out on Princeton University Press, 2022. Thank you so much, Jacob, for being here. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to all of you for attending this event. Let me share a screen with a handout on it. But there's a link to the handout too in the email that Megan sent around. And Megan, should I also share the link in the chat, do you think? Would that
I've just
be
put it in the chat. Thank you.
great? Okay, great. All right. Well, without further ado, then perhaps I should just dig in. Um, all right, so I've titled this Belief and Emotion in Roman Religion, Reconsidering John Sheid's Civic Model. So my book, Belief and Cult, Rethinking Roman Religion, it appeared with Princeton University Press a couple of years ago. Uh, for several decades, many scholars denied that belief had any role in Roman religion, which was conceived to be just entirely a matter of cult acts. In more recent years, though, scholars have reintroduced talk of belief into their analysis of Roman religion, but I would say belief itself has not been subjected to careful theorization. What is belief? So in my book, I attempt to theorize belief properly and rehabilitate it as an analytic category. And I also argue that when we have properly understood belief, it can help us understand other features of Roman religion, such as religious emotions, which I'll be talking about today, but also ritual norms, religious institutions, such as priesthoods and festivals, and other aspects of Roman cult practice. Now, so indeed, some of the scholars who have been reluctant to ascribe religious belief to the Romans have also wanted to minimize the emotional or affective dimensions of Roman cult. And so I also sought in my book to offer an adequate theory of emotion and to show that properly understood emotion is central to Roman religion in many ways. It's just different than the way it's central in Christianity, for example. So in many respects, my book represents a response to that great scholar of Roman religion, John Scheid. John Scheid worked out a nuanced, if minimalist, theory of belief's place in Roman religion, and even more minimalist was his conception of the place of emotion. My book, and even more to the point, this talk, could rightly be seen as building on, complementing, and extending the work of Scheid, even if it does occasionally offer criticism too. I'm not here to like trash Scheid's work or something like that. I think what he says is really valuable. I just think there are further steps we can go. So let's look at Scheid's work on belief and emotion and see where we can go from the foundations he established. So we'll start off talking about that, and then I'll move on to my own sort of additions, if you want, to Scheid's original structure. Okay, so let's note right at the start that John Scheid is a proponent of the polis religion or civic model of Roman religion. And that explains my subtitle, Reconsidering John Scheid's Civic Model. The basic idea is, in the words of Greg Wolfe, that ancient religion was, quote, essentially homologous with the social and political structures of ancient societies. That's the civic model or polis religion. So on that model, Roman religion means the institutions of public cult, which were, and I quote again, controlled and presided over by priests drawn from the civic elite, um, which collectively also had authority over the entirety of religious action within the polis and by its citizens. Okay, end quote. Any religious activity that fell outside the purview of the public cult, such as Bacchic cult, the so-called Oriental cults, magic, and so on, might be policed by the civic authorities as illegitimate superstitio. Now, what I'm not going to do here is evaluate Shedd's use of the polis model qua model. I'm not going to take him to task for using that model in the way he uses it. But what I want to do instead is evaluate his conception of the place of belief and emotion within that model. So I'm just going to take that model for granted and merely ask if belief and emotion get their due within its confines. And so we're really going to look only at, we're only going to look at the civic cult, the public cult. I'm not going to go looking at the worship of Isis or something like that. Okay, so that's what we're doing with that civic model of Shedd's. Now, I can hardly be alone in thinking that John Shedd's work on belief in Roman religion is the state of the art, or at least was until my book came along, of course. So, what is this? What is Shedd's theory of belief? What was this state of the art? Now, should say I don't think his comments about belief, not in his 2005 book, On faire c'est quoi, nor in his 2013 book, which was translated as The Gods, the State, and the Individual. I don't think anything he said there ever surpassed what he wrote in his 1993 article with Monica Linder. And there's a bibliography on your handout. The article was titled On croire c'est faire, when believing is doing. So Linder and Shed usefully limited belief, croyance, to quote, and now we're at the top of your handout. I've just given you the French, but I'll translate myself. They limit belief to the fact of believing true or possible a proposition that relates to the gods or to the system of things. Now, this is useful because it recognizes that belief doesn't have to be some sort of mystical Christianizing experience, a kind of leap of faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, to quote Hebrews, right? So some people would say the Romans didn't have belief because belief just is this sort of Christian thing. It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, and the Romans just didn't have that, and that's right. But they did have belief. So on this account, on Shedd's account, belief is merely a matter of accepting a proposition about the gods as true or likely. It's very, you know, deflationary, right? They also note that Roman religious beliefs will often be croyance implicite, so implicit beliefs. That is, they don't have to be explicitly articulated like a formal creed. So, and there again, people would say, well, the Romans didn't have a creed, so they didn't have belief. But Jed is usefully pointing out, you don't have to go around asserting, asserting propositions about the gods to have belief. You can have these more implicit beliefs. Okay, so he says he says that, and I quote, Roman belief was above all an act. It was a savoir faire and not a savoir penser. And then he says, and I quote again, we can say that among the Romans, believing was doing, executing correctly cult obligations, neither more nor less. Now, these and other considerations bring Linder and Shed to the conclusion that and I quote here again, there existed a faith, une foi, in Roman religion. It boiled down to one or two fundamental articles in scare quotes. It took for granted the existence of the gods and posed the necessity and the efficacy of ritual commerce with them. So those are the two articles of Roman faith. The gods exist, and ritual commerce with them is necessary and efficacious. So Linder and Shed then allow that it was possible for individuals to entertain beliefs outside of or in addition to these two articles of faith. But these two articles of faith were central to the communal state cult. And that's, we're in his polis religion model, right? These are the beliefs that are presupposed by the state cult. What you do in your spare time is up to you. Okay, that then is the essence of Shed's theory of Roman religious belief. Now, in the same article, Linder and Shed also link emotion and belief, although they do it fairly unsystematically and in passing. They write that in Roman religion, and I quote, emotion, or at least its violent public expression, and thus also the beliefs that ground it, were prohibited. End quote. Now, it's important to note that the theory they adumbrate here, to the effect that beliefs underlie or are causally implicated in emotions, I think that's a true theory, although they sort of, they sketch it rather than fully draw it out. For Linder and Shed, negative or passionate emotions were predicated on prohibited superstitious beliefs. In contrast, for them, cult predicated on appropriate traditional theological beliefs was practiced with a mind at peace. And let's see, we're down towards the end of we're at the end of the first page of the handout. The rites celebrated with the traditional tranquility of soul transmitted the statement that the gods were benevolent and agreed to maintain regulated social relationships with human partners. These statements constituted so many beliefs detectable under the cold appearance of ritual formalism. So tranquility of soul is the sort of byword and for Roman religion, and sort of more hot emotions are prohibited, he says. Now, so in later works such as The Gods, the State, and the Individual, Shed expanded upon his theory of Roman religious emotions. In that book, he reiterates his thesis that emotion is largely, or at least ideally, absent from Roman cult. He writes, and I quote, and now we're on to page 2 of the handout. Emotion did not form the basis or origin of belief and practice, but was potentially a consequence from excessive or poorly performed practice. End quote. Moreover, and here I quote again, the absence of emotion, or rather the control of it, was considered a preeminent religious virtue. So here again, Shed states his theory that in Roman religion, sharply circumscribed emotions were considered normative, and they reflected proper beliefs about the gods, while negative or excessive emotions were violations of the norm, and they arose from improper belief and action. Okay, so Shed's theory of belief remained the state-of-the-art account of Roman religious belief for 3 decades. It was, for a long time, it was the only alternative to a broader consensus that belief was simply irrelevant to Roman religion. His theory of emotions, on the other hand, it was perhaps less of a touchstone for other scholars, um, you know, but it's obviously important. Okay, so then my book came along, and do I have anything to add to this? Well, I think I do. I discuss in detail in the book questions that Shed only alludes to briefly or doesn't discuss at all. I'm just going to mention some things I talk about in the book. I talk about the cognitive theory of belief as a contentful mental state. I talk about the way psychologically natural intuitions of agency can give rise to or support Roman theological belief. I talk about something called belief intensity. Um, I talk about reflective and non-reflective theological beliefs. I talk about the distinction between belief that versus belief in. I talk about the role of belief in religious obligations and norms, the role of belief in individual and collective ritual action, and other topics besides. So here I just want to rehearse a little bit of what I say about belief in the book, just a very little, and then go on to discuss emotions and the relationship of belief to emotions. So this will build on and extend the theory that Linder and Shed had only sort of adumbrated or lightly sketched, to the effect that belief serves as a foundation for emotions. So I think they're right about that. Okay, so to begin with belief, let me just note, let me make one sort of critical remark, and let me note how unfortunate it has been for the study of any religion, really, to think that belief is somehow essentially a matter of propositions. Now, Linder and Shed had written, and I quote again, belief, la croyance, is believing true or possible, a proposition, une proposition, that relates to the gods or the system of things. Now, the trouble with talking about propositions, and very often in the literature, assent to propositions, is that it conveys the idea, whether intentionally or not, and I think in Shed's case, not, but it still conveys the idea that belief is a matter of linguistic representations, which we decide whether or not to endorse. And this makes it sound like believing is exclusive to Abrahamic faiths. Um, in Christianity, for example, creeds, explicit sets of assertions that believers are supposed to endorse and subscribe to, have long been central to religious identity. Um, but the trouble here is that belief, just as a mental state, is not fundamentally about our assessment of the truth or falsity of propositions or linguistic representations. More basically, belief is a matter of taking a state of affairs to obtain in the world. That is, belief is an attitude toward the way things stand in the world, not an attitude toward assertions or statements. When we believe that Jupiter is the god of the Capitoline, we're not believing something about the statement or proposition that Jupiter is the god of the Capitoline. Instead, we're believing something about Jupiter. So beliefs, in short, are about stuff. They're not about propositions. Um, Now, I go into some detail in the book talking about how the stuff beliefs are about are their objects. So every belief has an object. In this case, Jupiter is the object of our belief. But see, no one just believes Jupiter. Like that's not a belief, just Jupiter. Um, we believe something about Jupiter. We believe that there's a state of affairs about Jupiter. In this case, we believe that he's the god of the Capitoline. So the something that we believe about the object of a given belief is that belief's content. And the content of a belief is the way the belief represents its object. So we might believe that Jupiter is the god of the Capitoline, or we might believe that Jupiter is angry. These two beliefs have the same object, Jupiter, but they have different content. And it should go without saying that, of course, as I've been doing here, the content of these beliefs can be expressed linguistically, right? Um, but when we believe, we're not believing, we're not making a judgment about a linguistic proposition. We're making a judgment about the stuff that the linguistic proposition represents. When you believe Jupiter's the god of the Capitoline, you're not having a belief about a proposition. You're having a belief about Jupiter. Is he actually the god of the Capitoline or not? Or not. That's what your belief is about, the stuff, not the linguistic representation. I hope that makes sense. Um, Spelled out briefly like that. Okay, but if so, if that did make sense, this puts us in a position to theorize how beliefs are implicated in emotions, because emotion depends on belief. So how does that work? Anger, joy, grief, fear. These emotions are about states of affairs in the world, right? You're angry about something. You're grieving over something. You're afraid of something. It makes little sense to say, I'm grieving, but it's not about anything. I mean, that could be a mood disorder. But if that's correct, then we have to have beliefs about how states of affairs stand in the world before we can feel anger, joy, grief, and fear about those states of affairs. So, according to the so-called appraisal theory of emotions that I endorse in the book, the idea is that our beliefs, and of course, sometimes our immediate sensory perceptions, represent for us states of affairs in the world, and our emotions result from how we appraise or evaluate those states of affairs. For example, we might come to believe, perhaps because of a prodigy, that Jupiter is angry. And we might then appraise this state of affairs as threatening to our well being. The emotion of fear would then follow. So we believe a state of affairs obtains, Jupiter is angry. We appraise that state of affairs as threatening to us. And it's that appraisal of that state of affairs that results in fear, in this case. So belief is at the foundation of the fear because we need to believe that some state of affairs obtains before we can appraise it as frightening. Okay, so notice too that if the content of the belief changes, if the way your belief represents its object changes, then the emotion will change. If we come to believe, for example, that Jupiter has been placated, our fear will turn to relief. The content of the belief changes. Our appraisal of this new content will be different. We'll say, oh, that's good for us. And we'll feel, that's good. We'll feel relief or something. So it's important to note that ancient philosophers were the first to theorize that emotions were predicated on belief. And now we're looking at Cicero here, belief and emotions on the handout. Maybe I'll try to sort of, we're not going to read through that passage, but just point out a couple things. These modern theories of emotions actually derive from the Stoics and Epicureans. So Cicero presents in a Stoic theory. And he writes, and I quote, the entire cause, not only of distress, but also of all the remaining emotions, is in belief. And he uses the word opinio. And he says the belief for him, the belief is that a thing or circumstance, some state of affairs, is either good or bad for us. Aut boni, aut mali opinio. So when we believe that something is bad for us, this belief gives rise to negative emotions like sorrow and fear. But when we think that something is good for us, this belief gives rise to positive emotions like desire and joy. Actually, the Stoics didn't like any of these emotions, but that's beside the point. You can see the similarity of the Stoic account to the kind of account I was describing. Um, so, um, so armed with this theory, this appraisal theory of emotions that has its ancient sort of counterparts, it wouldn't have been alien to an ancient, Roman. Um, we can see some examples of this belief emotion dynamic in Roman religion beyond the example of superstition and excessive or poorly performed practices that Shed offers. So let's get into like some Livy here, and this is on the next page of the handout: prodigy and expiation. Let's just take, for example, Livy's account of the first year of the Second Punic War. It's the winter of 218 BCE, and many prodigies had occurred. And Livy writes, and I'm down in the highlighted parts of the text there. And I won't read all this. It's a long list of prodigies, but he says, among the prodigies, a 6-month-old freeborn infant shouted triumphe in the Forum Holitorium. In the Forum Boarium, a cow climbed of its own accord to a third floor, then, terrified by the uproar of the occupants, threw itself down. An image of ships appeared in the heavens, UFOs, I guess, right? And so you get a long list of prodigies, and these prodigies signaled a need to secure the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, through expiatory ritual action. Now, at the beginning of the passage, part I didn't actually read, Livy had noted that the Romans' minds were already stirred with religious concern. That's his terms, his terminology. Now, these prodigies only exacerbate this emotion. The Romans are already sort of a little bit worked up, and these prodigies make it worse. Um, Livy then details the state's efforts to expiate the prodigies. He says, on account of the other prodigia, the decemviri were ordered to consult the Sibylline books, but with respect to the rain of stones at Picenum, a 9-day sacrifice was declared. After that, practically the whole city was busied with taking care of the other prodigia. Now, Livy goes on to list lustrations, lectisternia, supplications, sacrifices, vows, and everyone takes part. And then he describes the psychological effect of all this ritual action. And this is at the very end of your passage on your handout there. Um, he says these ministrations and vows from the Sibylline books, for the most part, relieved, the verb is levare, minds of religious concern. And the word here is religio. So now Livy is using a formula here that recurs throughout his work. Levare, or sometimes liberare, mentes, minds, or sometimes animos, religione, from religio, to relieve or free minds of religious fear or concern. Now, the opposite effect, that is, filling minds with religio, is often signaled in Livy with the verb turbare, and I gave you a little example at the end of the that passage on page, what is it? Well, page maybe 4 of the handout. So to disturb, you know. Um, so let me then go back up to that beginning passage of the passage, the very beginning of this Livy passage. He wrote, during this winter at Rome or in the vicinity, many prodigia occurred, or what typically happens once minds have been stirred with religious concern, motis in religionem animis. Many prodigia were announced and rashly believed, credita sunt. Livy's language here explicitly says that religious emotions caused religious beliefs, right? It's the emotions that made uh, certain events more credible as prodigies. Now, recall Shedd's statement that, quote, emotion did not form the base or origin of belief. Here, what we're seeing is religious emotions of anxiety or concern leading to belief formation. Um, More occurrences are accepted as and believed to be prodigies than would otherwise have been the case um, if people hadn't been all worked up. So belief and emotion could thus enjoy a reciprocal relationship in Roman religion, the one causing or exacerbating the other. And we can, of course, see in this particular anecdote shades of Shedd's superstition or excess, right? These prodigia were rashly temere believed, after all. But the fact remains that supposing unusual events to be prodigies is squarely within the purview of the state cult of the 3rd century. And no matter how much elites like Livy in the early Principate might have cast aspersions upon the people's credulousness, you know, the fact is this is still just the state cult playing out the way the state cult plays out, you know. Um, so what we're seeing here is the interplay of belief and emotion could have material consequences for the Roman religious landscape and for state-sponsored cult. So what I think we have to accept, and you know, there's many descriptions like this in Livy of prodigies causing religious concern or religious fear, and then the state uh, undertaking a series of public cult actions that relieve that fear. And I think what we have to accept, given Livy's testimony, is that prodigy and expiation, emotional disturbance and emotional relief, marked a regular annual rhythm in Roman religious life, perhaps more so during some historical periods than others, right? I mean, this is the Second Punic War. Um, Indeed, I think we have to accept that all sorts of regular events on the religious calendar would have possessed emotional valence. I don't think we should suppose that the Lupercalia in February with its ritual running and whipping, young men running around naked, whipping young women. I don't think we can. It would be tough to imagine that this elicited no emotion of any sort. Or what of the Parentalia, also in February, a public festival for the dead of the family during which manes were worshipped as gods? And there's all sorts of taboos around the Parentalia, what you can and can't do. Are we to think that this period um, involved no emotion whatsoever? Or what of the Saturnalia in December with its feasting in the Temple of Saturn and the widespread joy said to accompany it? Our sources are clear that positive emotions such as Laetitia, and I gave you an example on the handout, abounded during this festival. So I think we have to I would propose that there are actually rhythms of sort of emotion that play out over the course of the Roman, calendar year, and they have to do with prodigies and expiation, and then they have to do uh, uh, with the festivals as well. Um, then I would also say there are more idiosyncratic ebbs and flows of emotion within this larger annual rhythm of prodigies and festivals. And let's just look at the example of auspication. This is a cult act accompanied with it's a cult act that accompanied a lot of public activity in which magistrates and priests ritually consulted the will of the gods, usually by observing the behavior of birds or assessing the resulting signs, the auspicia. Um, the appearance of positive auspicia could produce joy. Um, there are two basic types of auspicia. There are auspicia impetrativa and auspicia oblativa. Auspicia impetrativa are signs that that a priest or magistrate requests from the gods. And then there are auspicia oblativa that are unsought signs sent by the gods. You didn't ask for it, but the gods decided to tell you how they felt about something. Okay, so the adjective lightus is the classic term for positive emotion at the appearance of favorable auspicia, whether those auspicia are requested or not. So favorable auspicia generate laetitia, joy. Thus, in Livy, and let's see, yeah, we're on now to auspices and joy section of the handout. In Livy, when what is clearly an auspicium oblativum appears, Canaquil, an Etruscan noblewoman and eventual queen of Rome, is laeta, joyful. What she sees is an eagle swoop down out of the sky and pluck off and then replace her husband Lucumo's cap. She realizes, in effect, that this signifies his crowning by heaven. In fact, he goes on to become Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king and first Etruscan king of Rome. So, what this episode shows is that if prodigia could be alarming and could require ritual action for their expiation, another class of signs, auspicia oblativa, could produce joy. They produced laetitia in her, insofar as they were interpreted and believed to be a positive sign from the god. Now, I give another example on the handout that it comes from a time of conflict between the Gauls and the Romans. And I'll just sort of mention really briefly that essentially what happens is a young Roman, Marcus Valerius, engages in single combat with a Gaul, and he gets a sign, an auspicium oblativum. A raven lands on his helmet, and he's happy. He's joyful about this. He takes it as a good sign. And then he prays. He said, "Hey, gods, if you're really with me, help me out." And in fact, the raven then attacks the Gaul, and the Gaul takes the attack by the raven as a prodigium. He takes it and he responds with terror. He takes it as a negative sign. And in fact, the Roman defeats the Gaul. And what we see here is that we have the same sign, right? It's a raven, and it attacks the Gaul. It's the same sign. The two individuals involved have different beliefs about it. They appraise it differently. One appraises it as good for him, the other one appraises it as bad for him. And as a result, they have differing emotions. One of them feels joy, one of them feels terror. Um, and then if we go to a final example of this sort, now where are we here? We are, yes, we are in we're in the Third Samnite War. The year is 293 BCE. A man named Lucius Papirius Cursor is one of the consuls, and he and his colleague are fighting the Samnites. And Papirius decides, I'm going to attack the Samnites as soon as the auspices will allow. And he asks the keeper of the sacred chickens to go check the auspices. What it is, you feed the chickens, you give them grain, and if they eat, that's a good sign. That means that's a yes from the gods. If they won't eat, that's a no from the gods. Now, um, so he tells his chicken keeper to take the auspices. And in the meantime, he tells his army that the gods are on their side and that the gods are hostile to the Samnites because of treaties they've broken. And he tells them, in fact, that the Samnites are filled with fear because they know the gods are against them. Now, this fills his army with rather different emotions. They're filled with anger at the Samnites because of their perfidy. They're filled with hope for divine aid, and they're filled with eagerness for battle. The term is ardor. And they're also filled with resentment at the delay in getting into battle. Um, so let's see here. So when Papirius sends the keeper of the chickens to get the auspices, the keeper of the chickens is himself so filled with ardor for battle that he's feeling this emotion so strongly that even though the chickens don't eat, they give a negative answer, he goes back and announces that they did. Now, Papirius is lightus, joyful upon receiving this report. And he interprets this as an auspicium egregium, an outstanding auspice. Um, and here, I would just note that, ardor, this emotion resulting from belief in the god's favor, affected the chicken keeper's performance of his cult action. And then the performance of the cult action, in turn, caused the emotion of the consul. So there's this linkage between doing cult and the emotions and the performance of cult and emotions. I'm sorry, and then the performance of cult and the resulting emotions. And then the emotion of the consul, his Laetitia, helps motivate his initiation of the battle. He goes right out and he's like, "Let's do it, guys." Now, before the battle can begin, the falsification of the auspices is reported to Papirius, and he deals with it in a way that has drawn a lot of commentary. He announces that the mere report of the positive auspices was all the omen he needed. He says, if this chicken keeper who gave the report lied, well, that sin is on his head alone. And in a sense, he tests his theory by consulting the gods. He says, send that chicken keeper out to the front lines and let's see what happens to him. And when he gets out to the front lines, he immediately is killed by a stray javelin strike. And Papirius, when he sees that, he's like, whoa, this vindicates my theory that any sin devolves on his head alone and not on the army. And just as he's interpreting it this way, a raven cries out in front of him. And what emotion do you think he feels now? Laetitia. He's once again joyful at this new auspice that confirms that he was right. And with that, they just surge into battle, right? They've got all the proof they need that the gods are on their side, and the emotion sort of builds and builds, right? Okay, so that again, this intimate connection of cult action, emotion, and then action out in the world, going into battle. Okay, let's see here. I would just note then that people's in this story, people's emotions track their beliefs. When the Samnites believed the gods were against them, they felt fear. When the Romans believed the gods are for them, they felt hope and they felt ardor for battle. And when they receive positive signs, they feel joy, right? So people's beliefs and emotions motivate and guide their action. Um, and Yeah, including cult action. Okay, now I want to just close by pointing out something here. What we've done so far is we've confined ourselves to the human protagonists and antagonists in this story, to their beliefs and emotions, but we're missing half the picture. For the public cult of the Romans recognizes that the other set of participants in cult, the gods, are emotional beings. Indeed, in a sense, Roman cult was established as an institutionalized response to divine emotion, for the gods tend always to be either angry or indifferent, or, if approached correctly, pleased and propitious. So the Romans were deeply interested in what was going on in the divine mind, because as we've seen in some of these examples, they believed it had a direct bearing on the well being of Rome and the success of her projects. Now, their primary method of learning about the disposition of the gods was to watch for prodigies and auspicia oblativa, or to ask the gods directly through auspicia impetrativa, like when you consult the chickens. Um, yeah. So uh, if we think for a second about just take prodigia for a second, um, we can see, for example, I've given a list, an example on the handout here. Ira, under the heading Ira Deum, plague and mourning, where there's a plague sweeping through Rome and it's killing people, and it's been decided to be a prodigium that merits begging the pax of the gods, and the people are out in the shrines praying for the gods. It says the matrons were prostrate, prostrate, their hair sweeping the floors of the temples. They're in mourning as they beg the angry gods for pardon. So that the divine anger is something that humans are deeply interested in. If we go just in closing to this passage from Cicero, De Haruspicum Responsis. This is a speech Cicero delivered about a prodigium. And of course, he wanted to blame the prodigium and all the anger of the gods on his enemy Clodius, but we don't have to worry about that. But what Cicero says, he reports the findings of the haruspices, these Etruscan soothsayers, that why was there a prodigium? Well, it's because the games were celebrated without care and polluted, and sacred places were profaned. And I've given you a list of the sort of findings there on the handout. All this bad stuff happened, and Cicero goes on to explain just how minute these errors could be. He says if a dancer has stopped, if a flute player falls silent, if a boy has let go the rein of a chariot, these minor infractions could piss off the gods by making it so that the rite was not performed correctly. And in those cases, you have to start the rite over from scratch, and that's called instauratio. And Cicero says why we do instauratio. He says that when we do that, when we repeat a rite that we screwed up, this expiates ritual errors and the minds of the gods are appeased. So again, the emotional state of the gods is never far from view in Roman cult. And Roman cult, whether it's performed correctly or incorrectly, was believed to affect the gods' emotions. So let me just say then that we're in a position now to suggest that the way Shed looks at it, John Shed sees he has a sort of stiff upper lip kind of view of Roman cult, where you're just sort of supposed to keep your cool, not feel too emotional, go through the emotions in a sort of correct orthoprax and dispassionate, tranquil way. But I would say that's one way of looking at it. But another way to look at it is that Roman cult is itself emotion management. Roman cult has emotion at its center, and its purpose is Janus faced. One face is human facing. Its goal is to relieve human minds anxious about the gods and their affective states. And the other face of Roman cult is God facing, and its purpose is to placate the divine mind and to soothe the angers in the divine mind. Um, so this is a new way of looking at this norm of tranquility that Shed identified, right, in Roman cult. And so that's my sort of final proposal there. There's a kind of dual therapeutic purpose for Roman cult, and it's only when the god souls are tranquil and have been made tranquil through cult can human souls then in turn be tranquil. So that's what I've got to say. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry to have gone over. I'm happy to take any kinds of questions or comments or criticisms you may have.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I'm just gonna stop sharing your screen so we can see
Okay.
each other. And yeah, if anyone wants to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature, or you can just jump in. Phil?
Jacob, thanks very much. A great talk, really interesting, and lots of things I haven't really thought about in as much depth before. To what extent do you think that the positioning of those in authority in Roman society means that the way in which they have to be seen to react to things needs to be different from the ways in which the broader mass of the people need to react? And does that contribute to this idea of sort of seeming to be emotionless when in fact some of you may have very strong beliefs, just as strong as the people that you sort of want to manage their behavior, maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, that's surely like, there must be a book like 12 Principles of Good Leadership or something that that gives some, but you can see it in, for instance, the Aeneid, Aeneas's first speech to to the Trojans that he's rescued from Troy when they get shipwrecked in North Africa. It's the O Posse Grave Ores speech. Uh, um, uh, yeah, he gives this brave speech, and he says, "Forsan haiko lim meminisse juavit." Someday perhaps the memory of this will delight you. And things are going to get better, folks. And then the commentary by Virgil is, so he spoke, but he pressed down in his heart like great despair. And so, yeah, like there's this recognition that the job of a leader in the Roman world, unlike in the Greek world, right? What is it? Odysseus is always crying and weeping, and but in the Roman world, the job of a leader is to have that stiff upper lip and put on that brave face. Yeah, I think that's got to be right. But of course, part of the fun of Livy reading, these accounts is that it's full of accounts where leaders couldn't keep their composure. People do get freaked out by things that happen, and it has effects for the army and that kind of thing. But yeah, your overall point is absolutely right. Like the Romans, they had to present this face of composure, conviction, uh, confidence. Like we know this will work. We're sure this will work. Do you see any of us looking doubtful? No. Absolutely. I think that's got to be critical. Uh-huh.
I think somebody else was about to ask a question, and then we'll go to Nicola. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is Jane Whitehead. I wanted to ask you about the Etruscan mind, I guess. Etruscan religion is very much a part of Roman ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a difference in their mentality from what we know of the emotional complexity of the Etruscans as opposed to the Romans.
That's really interesting. I haven't sort of posed myself that question, but we're in this unfortunate predicament that we don't have a Livy for the Etruscans, and we don't have a Cicero, talking about his own interpretations of things. We have, bronze livers used for divining, and we have what we hear from the Romans about how they incorporated Etruscan practices into their own work. But yeah, I would not want to speculate on that, because if I did speculate, I would probably make, some of my old teachers who are experts in the Etruscans very angry for saying irresponsible things. But I mean, do you have a take on the on Etruscan sort of the affective nature of Etruscan religion, the sort of affective quality of it? Do you have a take
No,
yourself?
not really, but
Yeah.
it seems as though it was very well, they believed that you could read the will of the gods in certain omens, and they were
hmm
very they devised this bronzoscopic calendar, for example. Have you read the Jean Turfer's translation of that? Believing that these omens meant something specific was going to happen, and they had made a science out of it, and the Romans
hmm
called it science, in fact,
hmm
which seems lacking in religion, lacking in emotion, if it's
hmm
be a relationship between certain messages and your belief in what the gods will do.
hmm Oh, I wonder though, another way to look at the fact that they like made such they codified so carefully. They took so much care to make this sort of science out of these signs of the gods. I wonder if you could, one way to interpret that, this is inference, right? I'm just making inferences here. One way to interpret it would be that there was a great deal of emotional concern underlying that effort. Why would you do that unless it was really, you had a lot of religious sort of concern and anxiety in there? You know what I mean? The time, the cost to have done all that, to have come up with that, would seem to indicate a deep, yeah. I just want to say, yeah, concern. And concern is what's at the heart of emotion. So yeah, I don't know. It just strikes me anyone who takes that much time and effort um, must have. There's an energy there. That's just my inference. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, that I think is good. They also had a reverence for
hmm
places where lightning bolts struck,
hmm
and
hmm
they worship them, and that's sort of giving an emotion, I think, to a god or to a message
Oh.
that was sent. So there must be something there as well.
And reverence itself is an emotion.
Yes.
Sort of, it's an affective disposition toward an object. And so, yeah. And also, it's just speaking as not someone who's an expert on the Etruscans at all, but just looking at their tombstones and the wall paintings and their tombs and stuff like that. I mean, it's hard not to sort of get a feeling for very lively, affectively alive people. You know what I mean? It's so but I just can't say um, more than that. Yeah, I think it's
Well, thank
a
you.
great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Nicola?
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for that talk. I really appreciated it, and it's very interesting and very helpful to me. I am working right now, very gently at this point, on religious experience. So this category, right, this 19th century category, religious experience, which is very deeply, of course, informed by 19th century Protestantism, and it's very monotheistic and so on. And I'm wondering if there's a way of rehabilitating or making useful again this term of religious experience,
hmm
or whether, I guess, on the other side of it, we can call these, what I would say, religious experiences without the kind of capitalization of emotional reactions to a particular omen, for instance. Can we classify that as religious experience? I mean, in that that's a category where you have emotion and belief kind of constellated, right? These two things you've been talking about. So can we call an emotional reaction to a positive or negative omen a religious experience? What happens to the term when we do that? What happens to the way in which we think about emotion and belief in Roman religion when we do so? Do you have any helpful thoughts? Because that's what I'm sitting with.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question of like experience, whether religious or not, is just a question of it's a question of like what is it like for that person, right? So the whole concept of experience is based on an assumption that there are some things in the world that it's like something to be. Like we don't think that it's like something to be a chunk of granite, right? Like we don't wonder about the experience of Mount Shasta, it's just there. And but we think about the experience of our pets and our children and of course, other adults. And so I think it makes perfect sense to ask just at that really fundamental level about the experiences of ancient peoples. Was it like something to be them? And was it like something to be a Roman receiving an omen? Was it like something? Did it feel like something to be a Roman stepping into a temple? Then, of course, you have to be super careful because you can't just I mean, I don't have to tell you this or anyone here. You can't just naively assume some romantic way that, oh, it's so, when I step in the Pantheon and my breath is taken away, that must have been what it was like, because we're coming at the Pantheon through layers of romantic, this, that, and the other thing, and all sorts of, we've been prepared for that experience in a way that guides the experience, right? And another thing I would say is we have to, like in that 19th century concept of religious experience, wasn't it tied up with a 19th century idea that there's a distinctive human capacity for religiosity?
Yes.
And that religious experience would be somehow a reflection of or connected to this innate universal religiosity. I think we have to maybe we have to throw that out too and just say like what do we mean when we say religious experience? We mean that there are certain things in the social world that we can call religious because they have to do with interactions with the gods and experiences connected to those things, whether it's a practice or a object, could be called religious experiences. But we're doing it in this really like analytical way where we simply mean that when we say that so and so had a religious experience when they got an omen, we simply mean that they felt a certain way when they encountered an object that they thought was connected to gods. We're not saying that it's an expression of their religious stance towards the world or something, right? I think I'm preaching to the choir. I'm sure, yeah. But so, yeah, I think it can be rehabilitated in that way. That if you sort of demystify, in a sense, the whole thing, and just come back to the ground truth that beings such as ourselves do have experiences. It feels like something to be us. There's a phenomenology. So what is the phenomenology of human beings' encounters with what we, at least from our ethic perspective, call their religious world? You know what I mean? Like, and that's the other thing. Be real careful that this is an ethic enterprise. That if you ask that Roman, hey, did you just have a religious experience? Because it sure looks like one to me. They might just be baffled, right, by what do you mean by that? So as long as we're clear that we're carving out this domain of Roman stuff, and this is what we're calling religious, and we're trying to look for the affective landscape of this domain of stuff that we're calling religious. Does that make sense as a kind of answer to that question, do you think?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I mean, I
Yeah.
think, the heart of the 19th century experience, as you say, is really one of awe, right? And that we all have this particular capacity for
Yeah.
awe. And so
Yeah.
they're looking for the awe word. They're looking for something that looks like awe. And I'm picking up on the work of Mike Potzelt, who talks about ordinary religious experience. Is there a religious experience that doesn't hit the awe notes, but which
Yeah.
nevertheless it can be a moment of profound joy or, profound relief or whatever. Does that still sort of count as a category that we can sort of, in a sense, validate or look at and recognize as, again, the kind of that constellation of emotion and belief? So that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think absolutely. Yeah, because otherwise what we end up doing, if we think everything that the only thing that legitimately counts as a religious experience is something that's like where someone has a sensation of like awe in the face
Right.
of the transcendent or something like that,
Right.
then we're inevitably going to think that all sorts of religious traditions are sorely lacking and really jejune and empty, And
Right.
so yeah, we have to like on some level quit that and sort of try to honor them for what they were, And
Yep.
and in a sense, that's a kind of ethical approach towards the other, to say like, I'm going to take what you're telling me about your experience seriously and sort of not denigrate it by applying some category to it and deciding that it doesn't match up or
Right.
yeah, totally.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you have the time, Jacob, we can maybe
Sure.
do one more, and then
Sure,
I
sure.
apologize for everybody else, but we'll have to wrap it up after that. So, Ivana?
Yeah, thank you. My question, I really liked what you said at the end about the Roman cult being emotion management, and it took me back to the beginning of your talk where you talked about the fact that the official state religion aimed at something like tranquility, right? That this ease of heart, which seems like if religion is emotion management, then that would be the goal of religion, is to arrive at a state of emotional tranquility. So could it be that the sort of Sheed's initial reaction that Roman religion was not particularly emotional or not expressive of the negative emotions is an effect of looking at the written down official goal of the religion, which is to manage the emotion. And so any of these excesses that were experienced in kind of the unofficial religion were seen by the hierarchy and the main cult as insufficient religion because they were insufficient in the way that they managed the emotion of the people who were experiencing those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, I definitely think Shed has like latched on to something there. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to say, no, this was like Sufism, this was a religion of ecstatic abandon. Like, no. He's clearly right that this sort of tranquility is at the heart of it all. Um, and my question is sort of, okay, once you accept that, then what do you see? And you do see all this emotion swirling around that. But I do think the goal is, as you said, always to get to the place of tranquility. And that's not every religious system is like that, right? Some religious traditions at least make a big place for ecstatic abandon and collective effervescence and stuff. So yeah, I think that's absolutely the right way to look at it, exactly as you phrased it. So I think we can preserve Shed's insight while also maybe paying more respect to the emotion that does happen. You know what I mean? If
It's
that
sort of
makes sense.
looking at the ideal that the hierarchy has passed down or the civil
Mm-hmm.
religion has passed down and comparing that to the actual experience of people aiming at that ideal at various tiers of society.
that's a nice way to put it. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Ivana. All right. Well, thank you, Jacob, Mackey,
Thank
for
you.
being with us today, and thank you to everybody who came. The lecture was recorded, so if you weren't able to make it for the first part, you can find the recording on YouTube, etc. So thank you. We'll send out a
If
link to
anyone,
that.
if anyone wants to get in touch by email and with anything they want to discuss, I'm happy to talk. So my email's available there, right? Somewhere or other, maybe.
Yeah, we can send
In
out
the
the email to the RSVPs as well, so that
Great,
you can continue the conversation.
great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a great Saturday. And we hope to see you at the next one.